Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our seminar about the Climate Action Plan. We will start in just a minute as we give folks an opportunity to join. I can see that participants are joining the Zoom room now, so we will just hold on for another minute. Again, I'm keeping my eye on the participants joining, and they're coming in steadily. So I'm going to wait another 60 seconds and then we'll get rolling with this morning's seminar. Okay. Good morning, everyone, and welcome. It is still January, so I'm going to start off by saying Happy New Year, wishing you all a peaceful, healthy, and prosperous 2023. And welcome to our seminar this morning titled What's in the Plan, where we will do essentially a whirlwind tour through a 445-page climate scoping plan, which was finalized and adopted just this past December by New York's Climate Action Council. My name is Anne Reynolds. I'm the Executive Director of the Alliance for Clean Energy of New York. Many of you joining us today are members of ACE, but many of you are not. So I'll just say a minute on ACE New York. We are a member-based and mission-driven organization. Our mission is to promote clean energy in New York State, and our members are companies that are engaged in distributed and grid-scale solar, in land-based wind and offshore wind, energy efficiency and building retrofits, hydroelectric power and fuel cells, energy storage and transmission, manufacture of electric vehicles and electric charging infrastructure, plus environmental consulting, labor, and academic organizations. So in short, we are aiming to be the voice of the clean energy industry here in New York. Before I turn it over to our wonderful panelists that we have for today's seminar, I have a few logistical items and then just a word on our goal for today. So first, because people always ask, the slides will be available to those who registered for the webinar. And the webinar itself will be recorded and also will be made available to those who registered and also on the ACE New York website. And if you want to ask a question, please type in your question in the question and answer, the Q&A function on Zoom, which you should see at the bottom of your screen. You can do that when the presenters are speaking, during the presentations, or whenever a question strikes you. And we will get through as many of the questions as we can after the initial presentations from our panelists. I see that people are still joining. We're up to 180 participants now. So hopefully I'll repeat that about the Q&A before we get started. So secondly, I know the title of this webinar is What's in the Plan? It isn't overly creative or snappy title, but it is a question that I have been getting a lot lately. So I had the honor of serving on the Climate Action Council, and so I have been participating in the development of the plan since early 2020, though it is the folks you're going to hear from today that did all of the work. So I do know how much effort and expertise and time and public process and work went into developing this plan. So I really, really do not want this plan to be forgotten and get dusty on the shelf. I don't think that's going to happen, but the goal of today's webinar is ACE's little part in helping to ensure that that doesn't happen by getting the word out about this plan and what it includes. We want the members of the Alliance for Clean Energy New York, as well as agency staff and legislators and legislative staff, and lots of civic organizations and environmental organizations, and finally, regular New Yorkers to know what's in this plan, to know what it includes, and to know what it recommends and what it doesn't recommend. And we wanted to do this early in the legislative session, specifically so that action in the legislature on climate would be informed by this climate scoping plan. So we are also hoping to make this the first in a series of seminars on this topic. Today is going to be an overview with a simple goal of communicating what is included in the plan and answering questions. So I hope you all have a lot of questions. And once again, if you do, you should type them into the Q&A function. And then later seminars will dive into individual topics in more detail. So that's the plan, and that's our goal for today. We do have the perfect group of experts to present to you about what's in the plan, because they're essentially the folks who wrote it and analyzed all this information over recent years. We have Sarah Osgood. She's the executive director of the Climate Action Council at NYSERDA. She's going to give us an overview of some of the information in the plan. Then we are going to have Adam Reuter. He's an assistant director at NYSERDA covering clean transportation. We'll talk about some of the transportation aspects of the plan. Then we're going to have Vanessa Ulmer. She's a senior advisor at NYSERDA. She's going to cover the buildings and building decarbonization chapter of the plan. And then Jessica Waldorf. She's the chief of staff and director of policy implementation at New York State's Department of Public Service. Also dedicated a lot of her time in the recent years to developing this plan. She's going to talk about the electricity chapter today. And then we have Vlad Gutman-Britten, also at NYSERDA, an assistant director and for the policy and markets group, who's going to talk about the economy-wide strategies. And our plan here is to have each of those folks speak about 10 minutes, which, as I said, will be a whirlwind tour through what the plan says, and then we'll have some time for questions. And then when each of you completes your 10 minutes, if you could just turn it over to the next person on the list, that would be great. So in that spirit, I'm now going to turn it over to Sarah. Hi, Sarah. Good morning.
Good morning, Anne. Thanks for having me and my state colleagues here to talk about the scoping plan. So I'm going to start with just a high-level overview of the goals, the process for developing the plan, and some highlights from the work. So if we could go to the next slide. So I just wanted to start first with the Climate Act goals. I'm sure many of you are already familiar with these. These are, slides that we've been showing probably for the last 3 years where we've been developing the plan. But really, the Climate Act of 2019 established ambitious and nation-leading greenhouse gas reduction targets for the state. It put those targets in statute for the first time in New York. So importantly, we've got the 85% reduction in emissions below 1990 levels by 2050, 40% reduction in emissions by 2030, as well as a 100% zero emissions electricity goal by 2040. There were also several, as you can see here, technology-specific goals, although several of these have actually been increased by the governor subsequent to the Climate Act. So the energy storage goal I believe is now up to 6,000 megawatts, and distributed solar goal is 10,000 megawatts. Next slide. Just to help kind of set the stage of what we're talking about here, the scoping plan covers all aspects of New York's economy. And so if you take a look at the graphic on the left here, you can see the different sectors represented here by the level of emissions from those sectors. So here in yellow, you see buildings, blue, you see transportation, green is electricity generation. These 3 sectors make up the majority of greenhouse gas emissions in the state. And then on the right here, this is just showing what our greenhouse gas emissions were in 1990, more recently in 2019, and then showing that 40% reduction by 2030 and 85% reduction by 2050. So really just trying to emphasize, we're talking about quite significant, very dramatic reductions in emissions as a result of the Climate Act. Next slide, please. The council started its work in early 2020, and in the fall of 2020, established sectoral advisory panels and working groups to develop recommendations for the council to consider. Those advisory panels and working groups largely concluded their work in the spring of 2021 and presented their recommendations to the council in April and May. That also kicked off the heart of the integration analysis modeling work, where the recommendations from the panels were incorporated into modeling to determine their collective impact. In addition to the recommendations from the panels, we had several different scenarios modeled as a part of an overall cost-benefit analysis to provide a full picture of impacts of varying pressure on different policy levers. Ultimately, the recommendations from the panels and the results of the modeling work were released in a draft scoping plan at the end of 2021, and that really kicked off an intensive public feedback process. We had 6 months of open public comment, during which we also hosted 11 public hearings, and ultimately we received more than 35,000 written comments on the scoping plan. So really the second half of the past year was looking at those comments, processing them, and trying to be responsive through modifications in the scoping plan. If we could go to the next slide, please. So I wanted to just hit on some high-level findings from the integration analysis, because this really is important information about kind of the overall, what are we talking about here. So I think one of the first really important pieces is that it showed us that deep decarbonization is feasible by 2050. And achievement of emissions reductions to meet the state law will require action in all sectors, especially considering the novel accounting that New York has with respect to methane emissions, upstream emissions, and bioenergy. The second point, the second key finding was that energy efficiency and end-use electrification will be essential parts of any pathway to hit the emissions limits. We're seeing, we'd see a significant increase in adoption of heat pumps from around 20,000 a year currently to on the order of 250,000 annually, resulting in 1 to 2 million efficient homes electrified with heat pumps by 2030. And we're also seeing zero emission vehicle sales increasing from about 3% currently to over 90% by 2030. So quite significant there. But importantly, the analysis also showed that the cost of inaction exceeds the cost of action by more than 115 billion. So really what we're saying there is the emissions reduction strategy, they result in improved air quality, increased active transportation, energy efficiency interventions in low and moderate homes. They generate health benefits, greenhouse gas emissions avoided, also avoids the economic impacts of societal damages caused by climate change. And in addition to that, the overall cost benefit showing quite a significant benefit. If you also look at the jobs piece, we're looking at a very significant increase in jobs created as a result of this work, with as many as 211,000 jobs expected to be created in the growing sectors by 2030, and increasing by at least another 100,000 over the subsequent decade. And then finally, I'll just say one of the other pieces is that's important to know is that while we're talking about billions of dollars in terms of the cost benefits and what we'll get out of these investments, it sounds like a lot of money. It certainly is a lot of money. But when we look at it relative to the size of New York's economy, the net direct costs are a very small portion. And so if we can redirect some of our existing spending, that will help us to also mitigate some of the cost impacts from this work. Next slide, please. So I just want to highlight two aspects here in this and the next slide that are kind of overarching themes throughout the whole scoping plan. So the first is climate justice. This is a central part of the Climate Act. Requiring at least 35% with a goal of 40% of benefits of New York spending on clean energy to go to disadvantaged communities. And the disadvantaged communities term is a term of art or a defined term in the Climate Act. These are areas that are burdened by cumulative environmental pollution and other hazards that lead to negative health effects, and areas vulnerable to impacts of climate change. And so the Climate Justice Working Group has developed draft criteria for identifying disadvantaged communities. It was released in a little bit, I would say a little over or a little less than a year ago. And that has been out for public comment, and the Climate Justice Working Group will be finalizing that criteria very early this year. We're expecting in the first quarter here. And it's important to finalize that criteria because it's going to be used in a few specific ways. First, the Climate Act requires prioritization of measures that maximize net reductions of greenhouse gas emissions and co-pollutants in disadvantaged communities. And so those are kind of the first two items that you see on this list. The Climate Act also requires that DEC must ensure that activities undertaken to comply with the regulations do not result in a net increase in co-pollutant emissions or otherwise burden disadvantaged communities. And so that's really making sure that we don't continue to increase the burden of disadvantaged communities, and in fact are working to redress those that impact. And then, of course, importantly, the allocation of clean energy and energy efficiency investments to meet that 35 to 40% goal that is highlighted at the top here. Next slide. The second fundamental component of the Climate Act is related to economic opportunities and a just transition for all New Yorkers. We see that we understand that the transition may cause a shift from more traditional jobs, particularly in the energy sector. And so we want to make sure that we're not leaving folks behind. This is really a once in a lifetime opportunity to advance decarbonization policies that will also lift up and strengthen the state's economic development and growth opportunities. And so, as I mentioned, the analysis showed that we're looking on the order of over 200,000 jobs being added to the economy by 2030. But really at the heart of the just transition piece here is union labor. So the plan really emphasized that the jobs being created need to be good paying and family sustaining. And there were several pieces of a comprehensive strategy that are listed here at the bottom of the slide that were put forth by the Climate Justice Working Group to ensure that we have a just transition. So the first is to provide direct displaced worker support to mitigate any economic impact that current or former fossil fuel employees so they benefit from the transition to clean energy. to ensure the application of labor standards across all sectors and projects, to helping to create good union jobs and helping the state take advantage of new federal tax credits, and attracting greater financial benefits to New York. Targeting financial support for businesses to ensure access to contracting and procurement opportunities in the transition away from fossil fuels, creating new and comprehensive training curricula and programs focused on opportunities for people largely from underserved communities, expanding comprehensive career pathways programs for clean energy for both existing and future workers, leveraging community engagement, stakeholder input, and market assessments to identify and assess industry skills gaps, employee demands, and curriculum and training needs. And last but certainly not least, creation of an Office of Just Transition that would be used to centralize and direct state planning for a smooth and equitable transition for workers. So really the climate justice and just transition elements are underpinnings of all of the work or of all of the recommendations that are in the scoping plan. Next slide, please. And then finally, I just want to make it clear that while today we'll be talking about 4 specific areas of the scoping plan in a little bit more detail: transportation, buildings, electricity, and economy-wide strategies. Just wanted to make folks aware that there are that the scoping plan does cover all sectors of the economy, and you can see the other chapters that have additional recommendations here. I will say that recommendations that are within all of these chapters, they take a few different forms. Some of them, I'd say kind of maybe 5 different categories. We've got research, legislative action, regulatory or programmatic activities, education and outreach, and financial/incentives. And so those are kind of the main categories of recommendations, but you'll see in each of these sectors, we kind of dip into each of those types of strategies as well. And so with that quick overview, I will then ask to advance to the next slide, and I'll hand it over to Adam Reuter to speak to transportation.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you all for joining us this morning. I'm Adam Reuter. I am the Assistant Director for Clean Transportation at NYSERDA and lead the Clean Transportation team here. And really excited to present a little bit of what we worked on with the council and across a number of there's a lot of input from a number of agencies and stakeholders throughout the process. So if you could advance to the next slide. One of the key elements, and I think you'll hear this from others on the webinar this morning as well, is really first setting a vision of what we need to accomplish by 2030 and 2050 to achieve the greenhouse gas emission reduction goals for those years, but really to set ourselves up for success, because none of this action is going to take place in the next year or two. We're not going to be able to get there just by doing what we need to do in the next year or two. We really have to have this longer term vision. This was developed in part through the analysis that Vlad and his team have done, and he'll, I'm sure, talk a little bit more about that as well. But by 2030, we need to be pretty well on our way to electrifying the transportation sector. By 2030, nearly 100% of light duty vehicle sales and about 40% of medium and heavy duty vehicle sales must be zero emission. That's new sales, that's not vehicles on the road. But as Sarah alluded to, that's a big sea change from where we are today, where about 5 or 6% of new light duty vehicle sales were electric or zero emission last year. And I would say less than 1% of medium and heavy duty vehicle sales were. In addition to that, we need to make some major investments in public transportation, micromobility, bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure to give people other alternatives to use other decarbonized modes of transportation, not just cars and trucks. And how can we get there? Well, through regulatory actions like a clean transportation standard, potentially through land use policies, through incentives, through a wide range of actions that I'll go into a little bit more. As far as other options other than electrification, we do see hydrogen fuel cell vehicles beginning to emerge in the market by 2030, not taking a major piece of the market by then, but that could be an option for some of the sectors that are harder to electrify, subsectors that are harder to electrify. And by 2050, we see the shift to zero emission vehicles being largely completed, and accompanied by a significant increase in the use of these other low carbon transportation modes. This includes other non-road types of vehicles like maritime operations, port facilities. Aviation and rail are going to be tougher to electrify in a lot of cases, and they may continue to rely on hydrogen or in some cases renewable biofuels. To get to where we need to go in 2050, without question, we need to have some significant public and private collaboration and industry action. And our goal with this, I think, really is to help to get industry on understanding what we need to do and starting to move in that direction, and find opportunities to collaborate and to move things forward with industry. Next slide. So how are we going to get here, and want to dig in a little bit more? We've talked about how we really need to have a mix of zero emission vehicles, which are primarily going to be electric, but in certain areas they could use hydrogen fuel cell technologies or renewable diesel or other carbon-free power sources that we haven't even identified yet. Also, there needs to be a big focus on public transportation, walking, biking, other micromobility options that in and of themselves are also very low carbon, if not zero carbon. And that will help really make this much more affordable and viable and really accessible to all New Yorkers. So we'll do that through 4 key themes: transition to zero emission vehicles and equipment, enhancing public transportation and mobility alternatives, making sure that the built environment matches those by focusing on smart growth and mobility oriented development. And mobility oriented development, I should add, is a term that is a little bit more expansive than the traditional focus on transit oriented development to potentially support some of these other mobility options that we see as important to go beyond just public transit and really help bring people other low carbon alternatives to driving a single occupant vehicle. And then also market-based solutions and financing, and this could include a number of different options there. I'll dig into these a little bit more on the next slide if you can switch over. So to highlight a few of the recommendations for zero emission vehicles and equipment, I think there's a real understanding that we need to provide purchase incentives and support zero emission vehicle charging and fueling infrastructure, at least in the near term, as those markets are really becoming mature. And our hope is that as they reach scale, and we've seen this already happening, that as they reach scale, as there are more zero emission vehicles on the road and as they're more being produced, we will see more economies of scale there, and it will become more economically viable to install charging and fueling infrastructure without support from other means, because there are more vehicles that will use it, and more demand for it. But we see another accompanying need to enhance zero emission vehicle awareness and reduce sales barriers, because this doesn't just happen by itself. We know that there are folks who are not familiar with new technologies and are going to be wary of it, and we need to make it as easy as possible to go ahead and purchase these vehicles, and for consumers to want to purchase them. And then there's also a possibility of doing something similar to how the DERA requirements have impacted the construction equipment and trucks that are either owned by the state or owned by state contractors and used for state contracts, that required the best available control technology on those diesel trucks. There could be a way to do that to promote electrification as well, or at targeted facilities like port facilities. On the public transportation and smart growth side, this is going to require a lot of new investment and developing new service enhancements. The critical element of that is that it has to be done in collaboration with communities, because each community is going to need something a little bit different, and is going to be most successful if we design something that is appropriate for that community. In addition, we need to make it easier to use public transportation. That could be increasing frequency. It could be enhancing the mobile app experience, or the payment, ease of payment, or all of the above, to really just make it as easy for people to use public transportation as possible. Take away any excuses for not doing it. Likewise, we need to invest in mobility-oriented development and update the Smart Growth Public Infrastructure Policy Act to really make our communities more conducive to using public transportation and to using these other alternative modes of transportation, like biking and walking, that are going to help us meet our goals. And finally, in this area, we need to be funding new mobility options. So that could be car sharing and bike sharing, or setting up low emission zones in our cities, or car-free streets, that we can have real progress, especially in some of the most overburdened communities, in reducing pollution and reducing traffic, and which will also have the knock-on effect of improving safety, improving health benefits in our communities. Market-based policies and financing really could encompass a number of different things. This could include pricing policies that influence travel choices, such as variable parking pricing or mileage-based user fees. It could include enabling more low-cost financing of zero-emission vehicles through things like a first loss protection program that can help start the market, where a lot of financiers are hesitant to go ahead. And then finally, there's a consideration to implement a clean transportation standard. This has been introduced in the legislature as a clean fuel standard previously. There were a number of different aspects of that were proposed in the scoping plan. That's something that would be under consideration. So with that, I will pass the baton to Vanessa to talk about buildings. Vanessa, I don't think we can hear you.
Thank you, Adam. All right, thank you all. It's a pleasure to be here. Now you can hear me, correct, Adam?
Yep, we're good.
Great. My name is Vanessa Ulmer, and I lead NYSERDA's policy development team. and I had the pleasure of being on an interagency staff team that supported first an energy efficiency and housing advisory panel to the Climate Action Council, and then the development of the buildings chapter in the scoping plan. And I'd actually like to skip ahead 2 slides if we could. Perfect. So I just want to note up front that decarbonizing the building sector will require rapid and widespread energy efficiency upgrades and building electrification. So the plan really emphasizes the importance of energy efficient building envelopes, which have good air sealing, insulation, and windows, and which would be paired with good ventilation. This type of envelope makes buildings comfortable and healthier for occupants, and it also saves on energy bills. In addition, an energy efficient building envelope allows the building to install a smaller heating and cooling system, which is also less expensive, and it reduces the electricity needed to operate heat pumps at peak times, which is really important when we think about managing the impact on our electric grid with widespread electrification across our transportation and building systems. So to decarbonize space and water heating, the good news is that high efficiency heat pumps are a practical option today for most buildings in New York State. And honestly, the technology kind of just keeps getting better in terms of cold climate performance and the range of sizes and form factors that are becoming available in the market. So options available today that work well in New York buildings include cold climate air source heat pumps and ground source heat pumps. And then the plan, like New York State in general, places emphasis on developing thermal energy networks, which should actually link and share energy services across multiple buildings. Electrification also can be supported by the strategic utilization of alternative fuels. For example, pairing a cold climate air source heat pump with a small amount of supplemental heating, which could be fuel or wood, to meet heating needs at very cold temperatures, and also to, again, reduce the impact on the electric grid. Smart controls, energy storage, on-site renewables, and other features are also recognized in the plan as very important to support load flexibility in our building sector and indeed resilience for building occupants. So now I'm going to actually go back 1 slide, please, to just note the scale of the vision. And Sarah previewed some of this already. So we're talking about by 2030 in New York State, 1.5 to 2 million homes that are energy efficient and electrified with heat pumps, as well as 10 to 20% of commercial space statewide that's using a heat pump for its primary heating cooling system. Again, this is a very significant increase from where we are today, where we estimate roughly 200,000 housing units that are using a heat pump for their primary heating system, and commercial penetration in the very low single digits. By 2030, heat pumps will become the majority of new purchases for space and water heating. So whether that's in new construction or as an existing building, when it becomes time to replace a heating system, we need the majority of consumers selecting a heat pump. And that means that by 2030 and onward, as Sarah noted, we're expecting to see more than 250,000 homes and 1,000 more commercial buildings that each year would be retrofitting or constructed to be energy efficient and using a heat pump. That's, again, more than a 10-fold increase from kind of estimated adoption today. We know that we need to get started, given we need to get started now. We are getting started now, given that existing buildings will be replacing their building systems as those systems, age and are ready for replacement. And so getting started now allows us to hit the vision for 2050, which is that 85%, the very large majority of homes and commercial building space statewide, would be efficiently electrified and using a diverse mix of high efficiency heat pumps and thermal energy networks. Zero emission buildings by mid-century will need to become the most cost-effective option as part of our clean energy economy that's supporting secure jobs and demonstrating leadership in innovation. And in addition, by mid-century, New York State will advance the managed, phased, and just transition away from the reliance on fossil fuels in our buildings to a clean energy system And as Sarah and Adam and my co-presenters will all emphasize, that we'll do this in a way that supports vibrant, healthy communities and social and climate justice. So next slide, please. So in the buildings chapter, the scoping plan organizes recommendations into 4 key themes to enable building sector decarbonization. The first set of themes is regulatory in nature, adopting zero emission codes and standards and requiring energy benchmarking for buildings. The second theme recognizes that significant public investment in the form of scaling up public financial incentives, as well as public and private low-cost financing will be needed to enable this rapid transition towards building decarbonization. The third theme covers a number of important opportunities and needs to expand New York's commitment to market and workforce development, innovation, and leading by example in state projects. And then the fourth theme addresses the transition from hydrofluorocarbons. So we need to move away from hydrofluorocarbons, which are a highly potent greenhouse gas used in refrigeration and a lot of heating, ventilation, and air conditioning, or HVAC systems, as well as certain other building products, towards low and ultra low global warming potential refrigerants and other alternatives to those HFCs. Next slide, please. So now I'll provide some additional information, kind of keeping an eye on the time here. So I'll provide some additional information for some of the recommendations in the plan, and then happy to answer questions as time permits on others. So the first recommendation to note is adopting advanced state codes for new construction. So this type of advanced state code would require that all new construction, as well as major renovations and alterations that are subject to code, would be highly efficient and incorporate resilience features starting in 2025. This includes building with high performance envelopes, electric and EV readiness, and on-site solar wherever feasible. In addition, zero emission state code would prohibit the installation of fossil fuel combustion equipment in new construction for space conditioning, hot water, and appliances. And this is recommended to start in 2025 for single family and low-rise residential buildings, and in 2028 for multifamily buildings with more than 4 stories and for commercial buildings. So this policy really seizes the opportunity to build better buildings, which are going to be more comfortable, sustainable, and resilient at a minimal cost premium when that's done using efficient integrated design practices in new construction. In her State of the State address this year, Governor Hochul called upon New York State to put this recommendation for highly efficient and zero emission new construction codes into action. This is a very important opportunity for legislative partnership, and public engagement will also occur in a very meaningful way through the Codes Council. This recommendation also complements the governor's important goal of accelerating the construction of housing over the next decade. We want that housing to be, again, zero emissions, sustainable, and a great place for New Yorkers to live. The next recommendation I'll highlight is adopting standards for zero emission equipment. This recommendation focuses on existing buildings, which tend to be most cost effective in terms of making upgrades in common events in the building's life cycle, such as when you sell a building or when it's time to replace equipment because it's reached the end of its useful life. The recommendation calls for phasing out fossil fuel replacements of residential sized heating and cooling equipment and hot water equipment starting in 2030, and of commercial sized equipment starting in 2035. And it also addresses the replacement of cooking and clothes drying appliances starting in 2035 as well. So here again, the governor in her State of the State recently urged New York State to take a nation leading stance to advance this recommendation for heating, cooling, and hot water equipment. And the development of such standards will involve very significant and transparent public processes. Third to note in the kind of regulatory bucket here is requiring energy benchmarking and disclosure. A mandatory statewide benchmarking and disclosure program would require enabling legislation. And this could mean that starting in 2024, buildings larger than 10,000 square feet need to report on their energy and their water consumption, which will then inform decisions on upgrades and performance standards. Moving on to the second bucket of themes is scaling up public financial incentives for building decarbonization. Again, incentives for upgrades like weatherization and heat pumps are emphasized in the plan. And the plan also places priority on dedicated financial support programs for low and moderate income households, for affordable and public housing, and for buildings in disadvantaged communities, so that New Yorkers will all be able to make and benefit from energy upgrades that improve housing quality and paying careful attention to affordability. Governor Hochul actually announced launching a new Empower Plus program, which is a great example of providing additional funding for enabling weatherization and electrification of low-income housing, and also pairing that funding with a pilot program that would guarantee that participants stay within the state's energy affordability target of not paying more than 6% of their income on electricity. So this type of attention to providing low and moderate income households with the support they need to benefit from upgrades is really important and featured in the plan. Oh, I apologize. I think my computer just, I just lost you guys. Can you still hear me? Because I am using my phone.
We can hear you and see you.
Oh, you can still see me as well. Okay, that's great. So I will keep going and try to get my ability to see you to come back. In addition to financial incentives, as I mentioned, the plan recognizes the importance of expanding access to low-cost financing across a variety of mechanisms. All right, I think I should go to the next slide, please. And I, unfortunately, have lost access to my computer. So if it's okay, give me just 30 seconds. I'm going to see if I can fix this.
No problem, Vanessa. Take your time.
All right, my computer is doing some kind of forced restart, but it is coming back. So I think we're on the slide now.
It was the second one of highlighted buildings recommendations: thermal networks, workforce, transition from HFCs. Did we lose her? Seems that maybe we lost Vanessa. Jessica, do you want to start? And maybe we'll go back to Vanessa for this slide if she joins us again.
Sure, that's fine. Next slide, please. So the electricity sector is responsible for approximately 13% of the total New York State greenhouse gas emissions. The emissions are the result of the use of fossil fuels such as natural gas and oil to produce electricity. Significant progress has been made to reduce emissions in the electric sector due to investments in renewable energy like wind, solar, hydropower, and transitioning away from higher emitting energy sources like coal, which have reduced electricity emissions by almost 50% since 1990. However, if we scale up our work, we must scale up our work to realize an electricity system that produces no greenhouse gas emissions in 2040. Like the other sectoral chapters in the scoping plan, the electricity chapter lays out a vision for New York by 2030 and 2050. Regarding legislation, much of what will occur in the electric sector and what is outlined in the scoping plan is guided by the detailed requirements outlined in the Climate Act. By 2030, New York will have 70% of its electricity generated by renewable energy sources as required by the Act. Combined with the existing baseline of renewable facilities in the state, the current pipeline of renewable energy projects already under contract and in development will power approximately 66% of New York's electricity once operational. But we have more work to do, and the electricity chapter of the scoping plan outlines a series of requirements to get there. The Climate Act requires 6,000 megawatts of distributed solar by 2025 and 3,000 megawatts of energy storage to be installed by 2030. However, the state under Governor Hochul's leadership has set increased targets to deploy 10,000 megawatts of distributed solar and 6,000 megawatts of energy storage by 2030. Much of the focus between now and 2030 will involve aggressive deployment of existing renewable energy technologies and the continued build out of the transmission and distribution system to expand the statewide electric grid capacity. This includes addressing barriers to construction and operation of renewable energy projects to accelerate the pace of development and pursue the most cost-effective approach to decarbonizing the grid. By 2050, the state will install 9,000 megawatts of offshore wind. By 2035, and a zero-emission electricity system by 2040 as required by the Act. Additionally, the integration analysis in the scoping plan notes that even with aggressively managed load, electric consumption will double and peak load nearly doubles by 2050, and New York becomes a winter peaking system by 2035, all depending on the scale and timing of electrification for the building and transportation sectors. This projection includes offshore wind of about 15 gigawatts, solar of around 60 gigawatts, and 4 and 8 hour battery storage of around 20 gigawatts by 2050. Firm zero-emission resources will be important to ensure a reliable electricity system as we work towards building a zero-emission electric grid by 2040 and beyond. Before we get into the details of the specific strategies in this chapter, it's important to note that the plan identifies a need to coordinate the build-out of the electric grid with the transition of the state's gas system to ensure grid reliability needs are met and to ensure grid readiness at the wholesale power generation, transmission, and distribution levels for support of the state's electrification efforts. Next slide, please. As noted on the prior slide, the focus of the work in the electricity sector will be on scaling up clean energy resources such as land-based wind and solar, offshore wind, hydropower, energy storage, and other zero-emission technologies. Also, as part of clean energy infrastructure development and as new technologies and solutions emerge, the chapter notes the need for workforce development actions, including local and targeted hiring provisions, particularly to incentivize the hiring of workers from disadvantaged communities, as well as to support displaced and transitioning workers. Additionally, labor standards that are discussed in Chapter 7, Just Transition, are intended to apply throughout the plan, including for this sector, as a means of promoting good, family-sustaining union jobs accessible to all New Yorkers and achieving a true just transition. The electricity chapter was one of the longest ones and included 10 specific strategies within 3 key themes on transforming power generation, enhancing the grid, and investing in new technology. Within the category of transforming power generation, the focus is on the aggressive deployment of clean energy resources to decrease the use of fossil fuels in the electricity sector, and on the continuous evaluation of programs and policies that support these resources to ensure deployment is occurring at the pace necessary to achieve the Climate Act's requirements. The first strategy includes promulgation of emissions regulations and an evaluation of options to retire and/or repurpose existing fossil fuel generation facilities as part of the required biennial reviews of the Renewable Energy Program, including development of a blueprint to guide this retirement and redevelopment. The plan notes that pursuant to existing policies and procedures, any retirement and/or repurposing of existing fossil generation must be done in coordination with the Public Service Commission, the New York Independent System Operator Planning Process, the required reviews under Section 7.2 and 7.3 of the Climate Act, and consistent with the New York State Reliability Council criteria. The next strategy focuses on accelerating the growth of large-scale renewable energy generation, including continuous evaluation of policies and procurement targets to meet the Climate Act's requirements. This also includes supporting successful programs and identifying transmission and distribution needs. The Facilitate Distributed Energy Resources strategy includes the accelerated adoption of programs and technologies that increase hosting capacity, such as flexible interconnection and hybrid systems. In the strategy for supporting clean energy siting and community acceptance, there are recommendations for NYSERDA and the Department of Agriculture and Markets to commence a study on developing a comprehensive agrivoltaics program to research and incentivize the viability of agrivoltaics to integrate solar into agricultural communities and provide a habitat for threatened and endangered species. This strategy also includes recommendations to develop a clean energy development mapping tool and increase public education and outreach. The promotion of community choice aggregation strategy includes a recommendation for continued support of community choice aggregation programs where communities choose 100% renewable energy supply. It also includes enabling zero-emission microgrids and district systems and ensuring strong consumer protections to protect consumers and consider the most efficient way to maximize the benefits from renewable energy, particularly to low and moderate income households. The next category of enhancing the grid focuses on enhancements to improve the efficiency and delivery of electricity, facilitate the integration of renewable energy, prioritize clean energy resources, and ensure the electric grid's reliability and security. The first strategy focuses on deployment of existing storage technologies, including increased funding for energy storage development and incorporation of energy storage into energy delivery and transmission planning. It's important to note that Governor Hochul recently announced that NYSERDA and the Department of Public Service completed development of a roadmap to achieve the increased target referenced earlier of 6,000 megawatts of energy storage by 2030. This roadmap was submitted to the Public Service Commission for consideration and includes a comprehensive set of recommendations to expand New York's energy storage programs to cost-effectively unlock the growth of renewable energy across the state and bolster the grid's reliability and customer resilience. The Invest in Transmission and Distribution Infrastructure Upgrade strategy includes expansion of transmission and distribution systems, a recommendation to the Department of Environmental Conservation for regulations on reducing sulfur hexafluoride or SF6 emissions in transmission and distribution infrastructure, increasing local hosting capacity to support the integration of renewable energy resources, and support for port infrastructure investment for offshore wind. Next slide, please. The next strategy focuses on improving reliability, planning, and markets. Within this strategy are recommendations for market improvements with the New York Independent System Operator, including continuous evaluation of market products, requirements and technology standards for resource participation, wholesale market eligibility participation rules, and wholesale market energy price signals. The strategy also includes recommendations for support of distributed energy resources and demand-side opportunities. The Advancing Demand-Side Solution strategy focuses on the importance of reducing peak demand and increasing demand response programs to reduce the scope and cost of infrastructure build-out, and that as the state builds out a clean electric grid, it does not build extra capacity of renewable generation assets to meet a higher peak demand and run the risk of those assets being underutilized. The last strategy in this chapter focuses on the need to invest in new technology. The scoping plan and other current studies show that the 100% zero emission by 2040 goal requires between 15 gigawatts to 45 gigawatts of electricity from zero emission dispatchable resources to meet demand and maintain reliability depending on forecasted demand. In order to address this gap, the scoping plan includes a recommendation to identify and develop solutions for dispatchable technologies like energy storage or nuclear power that can be called on as needed to balance supply and demand. And wrapping up here quickly, the first component of the strategy focuses on the need to determine technologies to meet the zero emission grid by 2040 requirement. The Public Service Commission, as required by the Climate Act, is required to identify these technologies and to ensure consistency with the provisions outlined in the Act. This includes a comprehensive analysis of the life cycle of greenhouse gas emissions, benefits, safety considerations, and costs of these technologies. Regarding alternative fuels, the plan recommends the state prioritize zero emission resources such as energy storage, energy efficiency, and renewable energy where feasible. And it notes that alternative fuels such as green hydrogen and renewable natural gas should be targeted to strategic uses or when needed for safety, reliability, resilience, or affordability, and should demonstrate air quality, health, and life cycle greenhouse gas emissions benefits, including avoiding localized pollution in disadvantaged communities prior to implementation. And lastly, on nuclear, the plan recommends the state evaluate the role of existing nuclear reactors within the 100/40 requirements as part of policy actions needed prior to the cessation of the state's zero emissions credit program in 2029, and to also include the time needed for potential federal and state relicensing of these facilities, and time to determine refueling options at the different reactors. In addition, the plan recommends the state consider the potential contribution of advanced nuclear technologies in achieving the zero emission electricity by 2040 requirements. And with that, I'll turn it over to Vlad, or back to Vanessa. Up to you, Anne.
No, I think we're gonna go to Vlad because Vanessa's been weighing in, and we'll get her to cover some things during the question period.
Thanks, Jess, and thanks, Anne, and everybody. Happy to be with this group today. So I'll talk about the final kind of agenda item here, which is economy-wide policies, and in particular, we'll focus on cap and invest, which the governor announced a path-breaking policy in our state of the state. So on the next slide, pardon me. On the next slide, on this slide rather, thank you, sorry, describing sort of what the scoping plan recommended, which is that the state adopt a cap and invest policy really targeted to delivering on the Climate Act emission reductions established in law. And the governor has, since the conclusion of the Climate Act in the state of the state, has directed implementation and development of this policy. So DEC and NYSERDA teams are sharpening their pencils and continuing some of the work and the discussions that happened during the Climate Action Council process to really design a system targeted to delivering on the state priorities. So Cap and Invest our Cap and Invest program will establish a declining and enforceable cap on greenhouse gas emissions. It'll be designed to limit cost impacts, and most especially to the most vulnerable New Yorkers, and really invest proceeds in the transition that we need in a lot of the ways that the folks have already spoken to, the Vanessa and Adam and Jess and others have sort of described the various kind of investment targets that we have for building electrification, for vehicle electrification, and other similar initiatives like that. The governor identified 5 guiding principles in her state of the state last week, which include affordability. That'll be served through a variety of design mechanisms, but one of them will be hopefully the development of a universal climate action credit that the legislature will partner with the executive chamber and agencies to design over the course of the next several months, hopefully. Climate leadership, which is in a direction to agencies to design a program that really catalyzes other states to join New York. Obviously, if New York decarbonizes our economy, that's fantastic and great, and there'll be important benefits to New Yorkers. But universal climate action that spans borders is necessary for us to hold global warming to 1.5 degrees. And so we'll seek to design a program that catalyzes other action from peer states and allows linkage between these systems. We're directed to create jobs and protect competitiveness, so designed to make sure that our existing business base and employer base in New York can stay and really facilitate the continued growth and expansion of business and job opportunities in the state. We'll, of course, invest in disadvantaged communities, just as the Climate Act requires a minimum of a floor of 35% of revenue to be benefiting disadvantaged communities, as Sarah sort of described at the top. This system will certainly be one of the main vehicles for achieving those kinds of critical mass of investment in communities identified via that process, with a goal of 40% or above. And of course, as I said at the top, funding a sustainable future. So really creating an engine of investment across every corner of New York for all New York residents and businesses to really be able to afford, for the first time, in some cases, clean energy technologies that reduce air pollution, that reduce greenhouse gases, and improve the well-being of New Yorkers. So on the next slide, I'll provide a little bit of a description of how a system like this would work. So over the coming year, DEC and NYSERDA will design a program that, as I said, sets an annual and declining cap on the amount of greenhouse gas emissions allowed in the state of New York. That cap will gradually lower in pursuit of our 2030 and 2050 targets. And large-scale greenhouse gas emitters and large distributors of heating and transportation fuels will be required to sort of comply with this system. And so what that means is that the state of New York will be issuing, DEC, the Department of Environmental Conservation, will be issuing allowances equal to or less than the cap. And in order to emit a ton of greenhouse gas emissions, or to sell fuels that would emit a ton when used, an entity, an obligated party, a regulated party would have to retire an allowance. So for each ton emitted, an allowance has to be retired. And the amount of allowances, because the amount of allowances will gradually step down, that is the mechanism by which we will achieve our greenhouse gas targets. On a quarterly basis, the state will auction these allowances to obligated parties, and that's the way we would kind of generate revenue for investments to fund the climate action rebate, and to ensure a swift and just transition to a clean energy future. So this program, via these proceeds, will incentivize consumers, businesses, and others to make this transition. So this will be a sort of a dedicated revenue source to both support annual credits, rebates to every household in New York, as well as supporting incentives, grant programs, and other kind of like approaches as described by the previous panelists to really reduce the cost of the clean energy transition and to make sure that every New Yorker is able to afford it. The next slide, I'm just focusing on two kind of key principles. So one is this climate action rebate. So the governor has asked the legislature to create this credit to be funded out of a portion of cap and invest proceeds. The rebate is going to be designed to ensure that everyone in the state is able to receive such a credit, with low and moderate income folks potentially receiving an additional payment, so that we can make sure that they are in particular made whole for many of the impacts of this program. It'll be intended to fully mitigate the cost to LMI households, low and moderate income households, but everyone will be able to benefit, reducing total costs to all New Yorkers. The result from our perspective is that some households will actually be better off financially as a result of this program than they were before. If you by helping folks, because the rebate is not in proportion to how much energy an entity, a person, a household uses, some folks will be better off if you are able to, as a result of the program, afford an electric vehicle. If you're a transit dependent household, if you have a particularly energy efficient home, if as a result of the program we're able to deploy a zero emission heat pump to your premises, more and more people will continue to receive a credit, receive this rebate, while reducing their total exposure. So more and more households will actually be financially better off as a result of the enactment of this program and its rebate than they were before. And importantly, as I mentioned at the top, one of Governor Hochul's kind of overarching priorities is creating a vibrant and booming economic future for the state of New York. And so one of the ways that we were directed to pursue that is through these, just for special treatment for so-called EIT entities, energy intensive and trade exposed entities. These are mostly industrial facilities that compete on a global market that can't easily pass on their cost to consumers. And so what we want to do is make sure that they are still covered by the cap. They're still a part of how New York achieves our clean energy future, but that we subsidize and reduce their compliance to prevent their production from leaking, it's called, to other jurisdictions where emission protections and policies might not be quite as strong. So thereby increasing global emissions and keeping those jobs here. So by keeping those facilities here, while making sure we have an incentive to continue reducing, we'll both support the economic vibrancy of the state of New York and make sure that we're actually lowering global emissions as well. So this is intended to support existing business operations, but also support the growth and expansion of new opportunities, especially in the clean energy space, a major opportunity for New York job growth, as we have seen through the analysis done for the scoping plan. So I think I'll stop there, and I think Anne, should I pass it back to you for last closing thoughts and questions?
Yes. Okay, so as everyone heard, there's a lot in the plan. There's a lot of information that we just covered, but there's also a lot of questions that folks have asked, and we have a good solid 22 minutes to ask and answer questions. So if all of the panelists could turn on their video, and you will gradually be put on screen here. I'm going to throw out some questions for people, and they will be in no particular order, topically speaking. But let's start with, there's two questions about nuclear. One is, do you consider nuclear energy to be clean or to be renewable? And there's another question that says, do we need nuclear energy, new or extended, to address climate change? Or can we get there by transferring resources aggressively to renewables, efficiency, transmission, and storage? So I'm guessing maybe that's Jessica?
Sure. Thank you. And thanks to those that asked the questions. So I think at a top level, the recommendations that are outlined in the scoping plan focus on the need for the state pursuant to the climate action requirements for the PSC to determine what technologies will count towards the zero emission electricity grid by 2040 requirements. Nuclear is part of one of many technologies that will be considered. The scoping plan recognizes that the current zero emission credit program that's supported by the Public Service Commission and by ratepayers has a sunset date of 2029, and that a lot of decisions are going to need to be made between now and then. And so I would say that it's not, counted necessarily towards the 70 by 30 requirement, but certainly, something that will be looking towards the 100 by 40 requirements of the Climate Act.
Thanks, Jessica. I'm going to switch topics now. I think this one is for Adam. Are there examples of land use policies that would reduce single person vehicle miles?
Yeah, land use policies have a huge impact on vehicle miles traveled and single person vehicle miles. And where you look at the correlations between annual vehicle miles traveled or share of trips taken by public transit or biking or walking and land use patterns, there's a very strong correlation. So as far as what policies we can do to encourage different land uses, that tends to be a little bit trickier because land use decisions are primarily a local decision and not something the state can directly influence in many cases. But there are funding opportunities that we can do to help to improve the economics of building in a more sustainable and a smart growth type manner. There are financing mechanisms that we can make available, and there are ways that we can offer technical assistance, things like that, to encourage municipalities to take those actions that we deem as valuable for achieving this goal.
Alrighty, thanks so much. Why don't we stay with you, Adam? We've got a couple transportation questions here. Here's one. Buffalo's terrible blizzard required a huge commitment of diesel-fueled medium and heavy-duty trucks for snow removal. How can we be assured that rechargeable electric trucks can handle disaster intervention and mitigation?
That's a great question. As of today, we are trying out some heavy duty electric trucks with the Department of Sanitation in New York City. And you may know that the Department of Sanitation garbage trucks and street sweepers are also the snowplows in New York City. And we're taking some first steps, but these first electric trucks are not going to be the snowplows. They're probably not going to be the ones that are plowing in Buffalo or in some of the snow belt cities. We're not there yet, but we have a long time. The good thing is that we have time, and the technology is improving and is a lot better now than it was 5 or 10 years ago. And in another 5 or 10 years is going to be a lot better still. And so, as we think about which which subsectors to focus on first in electrifying, we need to be smart about it. We need to be strategic about it, and figure out where we can have success and build momentum, but also, build toward some of these harder to decarbonize and harder to electrify sectors like snowplows.
Thanks. Let's see. Here's one for Vanessa. Also a cold weather question. Do you envision that buildings in cold regions of the state, the North Country and Western New York, will need natural gas backups to heat buildings when blizzards disable access to electricity?
Thanks, Anne. And can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I actually saw a couple of questions in the chat about heat pump performance. So if it's okay, I'll just hit on a couple.
Sure.
So there was also a more general question about, are air source heat pumps able to be the only heating system in a cold climate without a backup heat source installed, particularly in areas with below freezing temperatures? And then again, this great question about what about blizzard conditions and the risk of power outages. So starting with the general performance, what the plan is recommending is the adoption of cold climate air source heat pumps. So cold climate air source heat pumps meet specific criteria. Here in the Northeast, we have an organization called NEAP, the Northeast Efficiency Partnership, that actually works with the market to set and continually update those criteria. And current criteria include being able to provide at least like a I'm trying to avoid using really technical terms. Sorry, being able to provide heating output that's at least 175% more efficient than electric resistance heating at 5 degrees Fahrenheit. So that's well below freezing. And then some of the kind of most advanced cold climate air source heat pumps right now available in particular for small residential homes or for single family homes operate as a heat pump down to like -10, -15 degrees Fahrenheit, and can even maintain kind of their main heating output at that 5 degrees Fahrenheit. So big picture, if you are in a newly built home or a home that does have good envelope performance in the downstate region of New York State, a cold climate air source heat pump properly installed and selected will definitely meet your heating needs without the need for backup heat. If you're in an older home and in regions of upstate New York where temperatures drop below zero, I mean, up by the Canadian border, temperatures can go to like -10. So if you're in those very cold parts of New York, then you'd work with your heat pump installer to decide how to select a cold climate air source heat pump and what type of supplemental heat might be appropriate for your home or for your building. So that's kind of the typical case where the electric grid is up and running and electricity is flowing to your home and to your heat pump. So what about the cases of power outages, and recognizing that in winter storms, if electric lines come down, it can take utility companies some days to get to all the homes to restore power. So the question was posed as to whether natural gas backup might be needed when blizzards disable access to electricity. So one thing to note is that most natural gas furnaces today actually also need electricity to operate. So you need electricity to start that furnace and for some fans. However, it needs less electricity to operate than a heat pump. So you could pair that natural gas furnace with a generator more easily than with a smaller generator. But in terms of like what type of solutions we're looking at for resilience, that is a great question. And I think there will be multiple answers, and that's an active area of research and development in New York State. So it could be pairing a heat pump with some on-site fuel or wood. Again, if it's a fuel-fired system, making sure that you also have a generator so that the heating system works. It could also be pairing a heat pump with on-site renewable generation and storage. And then we, as mentioned up top, need to make sure that our building envelopes are as sealed and insulated as possible so that the home itself can maintain comfortable conditions over a longer period of time. So thanks for the questions.
Thanks so much, Vanessa. There's so many good questions in here. I'm not sure which to pick, but so there's someone named Eric who asks, electric transmission lines will have to be expanded significantly. How will that be financed?
That's a great question. What I would say is that there are significant investments underway today, and right now, the way that those investments are financed is through ratepayer dollars, whether it is the utilities that are building out the transmission and distribution systems or competitive transmission projects. Both of those projects, either are financed through ratepayer dollars, financed through private capital, or a mix of both. But certainly, there will be a need to make significant additional investments in the transmission and distribution infrastructure, and we're hopeful that other resources such as funding coming out of the federal government will help to support New York State's initiatives in that area as well.
Thanks, Jess. All right, I want to make sure Vlad gets some questions on Cap and Invest. One is on the Cap and Invest program, will these regulated EITE, the trade exposed, energy intensive trade exposed entities be required to pay for both the Cap and Invest and RGGI fees? So they're the questioner is kind of mixing that up, but let me ask you another one at the same time. Do you have an estimate for the total size in dollars of the Cap and Invest program yet?
Sure. So EITEs, energy intensive and trade exposed businesses are, so that's not, are not likely to be electric generators. So RGGI, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, covers generators that use fossil fuel and that have emissions, and that's a separate class of potentially obligated regulated parties than EITEs. EITEs are traditionally sort of industrial facilities that produce goods in the state of New York, and they would receive this kind of special treatment where they would receive some portion of their allowances at no cost from the state. So those are two separate categories of entities. One is electric generators, the other is sort of industrial entities. The kind of overarching question, the kind of overarching answer, though, to some of these kind of specific design issues, including, and the sort of follow-up question that you asked, is that we don't have a final design yet. The Climate Act and existing state law in New York requires a really thorough and engaged public participation process for every policy choice that we will make, and that's what we'll be engaging in DC, NYSERDA, our partners at DPS, over the course of the next next year. And based on those designs is how we'll know, how do we treat electric generators? How do we make sure that we're reconciling their obligations under the full policy regime that New York's adopting to achieve our low carbon future, and as well as answering questions around, what is a likely allowance price, total revenue, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot more to come. There'll be a lot of opportunities to provide input and feedback to the state on the choices we need to make around this policy. And what we know for sure is that it'll be designed to achieve our emission reduction goals, and that'll be designed to sort of maximize competitiveness and affordability. But the particulars are to be determined over the course of the next year in partnership with potentially many of the people on this call today.
The next year. So just 1 year? That sounds like it's a lot of work to design that policy in a year. So
it's a lot of work. The Climate Act set that requirement to us, right? The Climate Act, and that's why we're on that timeline. The Climate Act says that by the end of this year, by January 1st, 2024, the DEC has to have adopted regulations that are intended to ensure achievement of those targets, which is why that's the target we are focused on, that deadline that we're focused on to deliver on our obligations that our state law has adopted under the Climate Act.
I'll keep you busy, Vlad. Let's see, we have a question from someone named John who asks, electricity that is purchased from various energy markets then wheeled into New York State. Is there any control on limiting the amount of power from fossil fuels in those cases? Electricity question. Does that go to you, Jess?
I think so. I'm happy to answer it. So definitely the way that we import and, the import and export of energy in New York is going to be something that we have to consider as part of the overall emissions of the electric sector. So I would say that between now and the 2030 and 2040 targets, we'll certainly be looking to address the emissions that are coming in that are related to the imports of electricity into the state.
And we have another question on electricity. So stay on screen, Jess. We have from Ethan. The estimates for energy futures are renewable big power percentage estimates from wind and solar. When the sun doesn't shine and the wind doesn't blow, how is power usage shortage managed? I guess that means just how are we going to meet power demand at that time?
Sure.
Yep.
I could take that one.
Yeah.
So I would say that certainly the need to ensure the overall reliability of the grid, from where I sit at the Department of Public Service and the Commission, it's something that we are constantly thinking about. And as we continue to integrate more and more intermittent resources onto the electric grid, we're also implementing policies to balance that. Things like deployment of energy storage, as well as the need to identify and develop zero emission technologies that can provide that balance to those resources. But that is definitely a key consideration outlined in the scoping plan. But outside of the scoping plan, it's a key consideration that the state is well aware of and paying attention to on a daily basis.
Can I just add to that just really briefly?
Of course.
So agree on all counts with Jess. I think that one of the things that, just to put sort of in perspective the way this kind of showed up, NYSERDA oversaw something called the integration analysis, which helped inform a lot of the recommendations in the plan. And one of the kind of resources that we rely on out in 2050 is a sort of a general resource called in the analysis we called a zero carbon firm resource, zero carbon dispatchable resource. And while there's a fairly substantial amount of it in terms of capacity, the number of megawatts, the amount of possible generation that a resource like that produces, in terms of the total energy picture, it was very small. So it's an important part of how we achieve our zero carbon future. The way we modeled it in the integration analysis was as hydrogen. But in one of the scenarios, for example, the total amount of energy that we consume from this category of resource in 2050 was just over 1%. So while we had tens of thousands of megawatts of capacity, the ability to use it all at once, the way it actually contributed to energy over the course of the year was pretty small. And the bulk of our energy was still coming from wind and solar and existing resources, including our existing nuclear plants. So it's an important piece of the puzzle, but it's important to sort of note that it's really kind of helping us out on these key small situations where indeed our renewable resources are not available. So we will design a grid that is sort of resilient to all of these eventualities and does include resources like that, but in total, energy efficiency, solar, wind, and many of our existing clean energy resources are how we serve most of our energy by mid-century.
Great. Let's see. Here's a question. How much is pumped storage being considered to meet the storage goals? Given the elevation changes in the state, this would seem like an advantageous technology for New York. Anyone want to talk about pumped storage or long duration storage in general?
Sure. I would say long duration storage, including pumped storage, is definitely part of that picture. I think as the Commission considers the updated energy storage roadmap, as we implement other policies around support for energy storage, we'll be looking at all technologies. And I would note that there's at least one pump storage facility that I'm very familiar with that helps support the state. And I think that, as well as many other long duration storage technologies, will be considered.
And I think you mentioned was it 20 gigawatts of short and long duration storage, Jessica, in the 2050 vision storage that was on one of the slides. We're going to need a lot of it.
We're going to need a lot of it.
There's a question about, well, actually, this one I think is a short one. Jessica mentioned that 66% of the 70% renewable energy target is already contracted. Is that 70% based on the existing baseline electric load? That's based on the 2030 predicted load. That part was me answering. And then the second part is the question. So when the electric sector doubles, the demand doubles because of increased electrification, the percent of renewables already contracted will be reduced. That's true. As electricity demand, I would put it a different way. As electricity demand continues to grow, we have to keep building renewables to stay steady at that 70% and to move to that 100% emissions free. Is that a correct?
That 2030 target does include some of that growth. It's not from today's load.
Yeah, the predicted 2030 load demand, which is going down because of efficiency and going up because of electrification, right, between now and 2030. And there was finally a question about agrivoltaics that was mentioned. The questioner asks, interested to hear more about the comprehensive agrivoltaics program and how the agricultural community will be engaged. Other states are looking to New York for leadership here. Any comments?
I would certainly agree with that comment on other states looking to New York for leadership on this, and a lot of the work that we're doing on the clean energy front. We have a number of different activities that already take place with regards to renewable energy in the agricultural sector through various working groups and through various policies that are long established, either at the Public Service Commission, at NYSERDA, or at Ag and Markets, with how renewable energy systems and agricultural policies interact. Very similarly, with the development of the agrivoltaics program, we would certainly engage stakeholders as part of the development of that program, and something that we do a lot of in the development of the various clean energy programs. And it's helpful.
And I've got one last question because we've run out of time. Are there any plans to include renewable energy sources on municipal buildings?
Why, definitely. And I would say that there are a lot of local governments throughout the state that are already municipal leaders in adopting clean energy technologies. We hope to see a lot more of that between now and 2030 and for all the years to come.
All right, we've made ourselves till 12. We've made it till 12 o'clock here. So as usual, ran out of time to answer all the questions. But first of all, a big hearty thank you to you guys, Jessica, Adam, Vanessa, Sarah, and Vlad. Not just for today's presentation, but for everything you've been doing for the last 2.5 years to get this plan over the finish line. And to those of you who participated, we had a great participation today. I'm so glad that folks tuned in. It will also be available, as I said, as a recording. So if you have colleagues who want to learn more about what's in the plan, you can pass that on to them. And this, as I said, is the first in a series for ACE. We hope to have 3 more where we'll dive into the chapters more deeply. But thank you all for joining us. Again, here's to a prosperous and healthy 2023. And you can now move on to your lunch break. Thanks, guys. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.